new details into out front about the man who allegedly murdered Charlie Kirk. Suspect's name is Tyler James Robinson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We got him.
President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump marking the 24th anniversary of 9/11, attending a memorial service today at the Pentagon.
The air was heavy with remembrance, a September morning that demanded solemnity. Yet, as the nation bowed its head to honor the fallen of 9/11s, one figure stood out, not for his leadership, not for his words of comfort, but for the startling frailty he revealed. Cameras turned toward Donald Trump, and what they captured ignited whispers across the country. A face slack and weary, eyes distant, movements uncertain. Was this simply a bad day or the unveiling of something far more serious? The Pentagon ceremony was meant to be a moment of unity, a time to honor the memory of those who perished on one of the darkest days in American history. Rows of names echoed through the air, each syllable representing a life cut short, each pause a reminder of enduring grief. But while the nation grieved together, another narrative silently unfolded before the cameras. Donald Trump appeared pale and drooping, as though gravity had taken a harsher toll on him than on anyone else around. Observers commented that he seemed disoriented, as if he wasn't entirely aware of where he was. This was not the image of a former president radiating strength. Instead, it raised troubling questions. Was Trump's health slipping? Were long-rumored strokes or neurological issues finally revealing themselves in plain sight? For years, speculation about his health had circulated. Doctors who had watched his public speeches noted his struggle to find words, his slurred phrases, his odd inability to finish thoughts. One physician, Dr. Shiner, warned that these weren't simple slips of the tongue, but signs of something deeper, perhaps small strokes or a neurological decline. And now, in the hushed backdrop of a 9/11's memorial, millions witnessed evidence that seemed to align with those concerns. Yet, while Trump's demeanor dominated headlines, the day carried more than questions about his well-being. Earlier that morning, another wave of news hit households. Inflation numbers were worse than expected. Headline inflation climbed to 2.9%, while core inflation surged to 3.1%. Food, gas, shelter, all pressing costs were climbing. Families across the country didn't need the statistics to tell them. Their grocery bills and rent receipts painted the story clearly enough. From coffee to clothing, from furniture to fuel, prices continued their relentless march upward. Coffee alone had risen more than 20% in a single year. Dining furniture, tools, even everyday essentials like toilet paper, everything seemed heavier on the wallet. Economists warned this was just the beginning. Projections suggested that by 2026 and 2027, the pressure could become unbearable for working families. And just as inflation spiked, so too did unemployment signals. Jobless claims climbed to 263,000, the highest in nearly 4 years. Behind those numbers were real people, neighbors, classmates, friends, who suddenly found themselves without a paycheck. The dreaded phrase mass layoffs wasn't an abstract possibility anymore. It was a lived reality. This economic turbulence wasn't merely coincidence. Analysts pointed fingers at policies, decisions, and broken promises. Trump, once the self-proclaimed master of deals, had pledged to bring down healthcare costs. Instead, they had soared to record highs, burdening both individuals and businesses. A promise of relief had transformed into a painful reality of mounting bills and shrinking security. But the turbulence of that September day didn't end with health and economics. Another flash of violence tore through the news cycle. The FBI released an image of a suspect wanted in connection with the fatal shooting of political commentator Charlie Kirk. The photo showed a young man, thin and pale, wearing an American flag shirt. While speculation swirled, one fact was clear. Political violence was no longer a fringe concern. It was becoming frighteningly common. And in the same breath, reports arrived from Colorado. Another school shooting. 3 students injured, lives forever altered. For parents and classmates, the statistics meant nothing compared to the sirens, the phone calls, the fear that the next knock on the door could deliver shattering news. For many Americans, these events blended into a troubling picture. A frail former president, a struggling economy, political violence, and relentless school shootings, it all painted a portrait of a nation under strain. The ceremony at the Pentagon may have been rooted in remembrance, but the day's news reminded citizens that the challenges of today were as urgent as the tragedies of the past. Observers couldn't help but recall Trump's infamous remarks on the original day of tragedy, September 11, 2001. When the nation was reeling, he had bragged on live television that one of his buildings was now the tallest in Manhattan. That instinct to place self over solemnity echoed across decades, resurfacing as he stood at the Pentagon ceremony. The same instinct, many argued, still shaped his politics, even as questions mounted about his capacity to lead. As the sun set on that day, Americans were left wrestling with more than grief and memory. They were left with gnawing questions. Could Trump's health issues alter the political landscape? Would inflation and unemployment continue to suffocate working families? And would the cycle of violence, political assassinations, school shootings, Civil War-tinged rhetoric ever end? The ceremony that was meant to unify had instead spotlighted division, fragility, and fear. What was supposed to be a solemn pause in time became a mirror reflecting a nation on edge. The story of that day, however, was only half told. Because what came after Agar, dangerous rhetoric, and calls to arms would push the narrative from troubling into truly alarming. Words are not harmless. They spark fires, ignite movements, and sometimes, tragically, they load the chambers of guns. In the aftermath of a day already heavy with grief and uncertainty, America faced not only the visible decline of a former president and the rising costs of survival, but also a swelling tide of words meant to divide, inflame, and prepare a battlefield of ideas that threatened to spill into real bloodshed. As news of Charlie Kirk's assassination broke, the immediate reactions followed a familiar and dangerous script. Without waiting for facts, MAGA figures hurled accusations at liberals, painting Democrats and progressives as masterminds of political violence. The rhetoric was sharp, emotional, and calculated to stoke fury. To them, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was an opportunity to galvanize their base against an imagined enemy. Yet, as details began to surface, the narrative fractured. The suspect was not a radical leftist. Instead, he appeared to come from the same ideological circles that MAGA leaders claimed to defend. But by then, the words had already spread like wildfire. Outrage had already been bottled, shaken, and uncorked. This pattern was not new. When Trump himself survived an assassination attempt earlier in the year, his supporters immediately blamed liberals. Only later did evidence reveal the attacker was a right-wing extremist. Once again, the truth lagged far behind the story told to millions of eager ears. And once again, violence became less a shocking anomaly and more a recurring headline. On Capitol Hill, the language of division found a louder stage. One MAGA-aligned congressman declared bluntly, "There is no longer any middle ground. The American left is pure evil. They embrace the ugly and hate the good, just as Marx and Lenin did." These words were not simply rhetorical flourishes. They were lines in the sand. They branded political opponents not merely as rivals, but as existential enemies, the kind who must be fought, defeated, even eliminated. It was rhetoric steeped in history, the kind of language once used to justify purges, revolutions, and wars. For ordinary Americans listening, the consequences were chilling. If your neighbor is not simply someone who disagrees with you, but someone who is evil, what does that mean for the future of neighborhoods, schools, workplaces? When your political opponent is framed as a threat to everything good, true, and beautiful, compromise vanishes. What remains is conflict. Meanwhile, violence continued to seep into the everyday fabric of the nation. The school shooting in Colorado offered a devastating reminder. On the same day Charlie Kirk was killed, 3 students were gunned down in their classrooms. Their classmates, families, and communities were thrust into the all-too-familiar cycle of trauma. Lockdown drills, frantic texts, candlelight vigils. Journalist Kyle Clark captured the moment with haunting clarity. A famous man was shot in Utah today. School children were shot here in Colorado. Each life had worth and value, but all of them lived in a country where too many believe violence is the answer. His words cut to the heart of the sickness spreading through American society. Violence was no longer confined to the margins. It had seeped into the center, normalized by political leaders, echoed by influencers, and carried out by individuals who believed a gunshot could settle an argument. And in this atmosphere, Trump's frailty at the 9/11 ceremony took on new meaning. His slurred words, his wandering gaze, his uncertain steps, they symbolized more than personal health concerns. To many, they symbolized the fragility of a movement built on anger and division. For all his bluster, Trump himself seemed weaker, physically and politically, than ever before. Yet weakness, paradoxically, can breed desperation, and desperation fuels extremes. As inflation strained families, as layoffs grew, as healthcare costs ballooned, many clung tighter to political identities that promised revenge rather than solutions. Instead of uniting against shared challenges, citizens were pushed to view each other as enemies in a looming civil conflict. The rhetoric of civil war no longer hid in dark internet forums. It bled into congressional speeches, cable news debates, and viral social media clips. Prominent figures spoke openly of roundups, massacres, and purges. The echoes of history Stalin, Castro, Pol Pot were invoked to justify aggression against fellow Americans. But words do not stay words for long. They inspire actions. They inspire shooters who walk into schools, extremists who target politicians, and mobs who see violence not as crime, but as patriotism. Each new tragedy confirmed a terrible reality. America was not simply divided. It was becoming dangerous to live in. On that September day, the Pentagon ceremony was supposed to remind the nation of resilience. Instead, it spotlighted fragility. Fragility in leadership, fragility in economics, fragility in unity. For many, it was a turning point not because of one man's drooping face, but because of the convergence of crises. Trump looked frail. The economy looked unstable. Political discourse looked combustible, and violence looked inevitable. What had begun as a ceremony of remembrance transformed into a mirror held up to the nation, showing not just where it had been, but where it was heading. And what that reflection revealed was sobering. A country at risk of tearing itself apart, not from foreign enemies, but from within. As night fell on September 11th, the memorial lights in New York stretched into the sky, two beams cutting through the darkness. They were meant as symbols of endurance, of hope that light would always pierce shadow. Yet across the nation, conversations simmered with fear. Would America find its way back to unity, or was it already too late? The day had begun with solemn remembrance. It ended with the realization that the greatest threats facing the nation were not memorialized in stone or ceremonies. They were alive, present, and growing louder with every passing hour. And the question that lingered was the most unsettling of all. If this is only the beginning, what comes next?